Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week, slightly different. I'd like to revisit a topic that we touched on last year, but really spend all our time on the fundamental issue of the order of the Torah. If we're going to do Rambans every week, this is a fundamental machlokas between the Ramban and Rashi. And really, if you had to find the headquarters for this machlokas, it would be the beginning of Parshas Teruma, because it impacts how we see the next 5 parshiot. Teruma, Tetzava, Kitisa, Vayakal, Pekude are in different orders according to Rashi and according to the Ramban. Now, substantively, I don't really think there's a machlokes, but in form there is, and it's worth spending our time on. So let's start at the very beginning with Shitas Rashi. This is something that we all know. We know that there's a Rashi that says, Ein mukdam muchar b'Torah. But we also have the feeling, and we have the feeling because it's true, that Rashi doesn't really mean it. Rashi knows that Noach came before Avraham, and Avraham came before Yitzchak, and Yitzchak came before Yaakov, and that Parshas Lech Lecha came before Parshas Vayishlach. Rashi knows all this. He doesn't mean literally there is no order to the Torah. Rather, he means that for educational purposes, when the Torah has a reason to change the order, to make a point, the Torah does that. And Rashi thinks that our Parsha is the perfect example of that. I don't know if it's a perfect example, but our Parsha is an example of that. And if you look in the Rashi, in the middle of Parshat Kitisa, it's Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Yud Ches. The Pasuk says, Vayiten el Moshe kechaloto ledaber ito bahar Sinai shnei luchot ha'idut, luchot even ketuvim be'etzba Elohim. Says Rashi right there, Ein mukdam u'mu'uchar b'Torah. That's the famous line, and we know it well. Now Rashi explains, Ma'aseh ha'egel kodem litzivui melechet ha'mishkan yamim rabim haya. Says Rashi, if you read the Torah in order, you would assume that Parshas Teruma and Parshas Tetzaveh, really the commandments of the mitzvahs HaMishkan, came before Parshas Kitisa, which is the Chet HaEgel. Says Rashi, that's not true. The Chet HaEgel came well before the commandment to build the Mishkan. How does he know this? And it's no debate. The Ramban will agree with this. Sharei biyud zayin b'tamuz nishtabu haluchot. Right, Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai on Shiva Asar b'tamuz, as the Mishnah says, and he saw the Egel u'mecholot, and he was furious, and he broke the luchos. Uviyom haKippurim nitrasa hakadosh baruch hu Yisrael. And later on, 120 days later, after 3 stints of 40 days and 40 nights each on Har Sinai, God finally forgave us completely on Yom Kippur, on Yud Tishrei. Ulemachrat hitchilu b'nidvat hamishkan v'hukam be'echad b'nisan. And on the morrow, on Yud Aleph Tishrei, Bnei Yisrael started collecting funds for the Mishkan and started building the Mishkan, which was completed more or less 6 months later on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and that is the dedication of the Mishkan. Okay, and says Rashi, that's the order. Now, the Ramban doesn't really disagree with the order. He just disagrees with the concept. Now, how do I know that? So first of all, the Ramban says it. We're not going to do those Rambans today, but there are examples in the Torah that are debatable. Let's say our example today. The example of, did Moshe Rabbeinu give the commandment to build the Mishkan before or after Chet HaEgel? Right? The Ramban is right in that Parshas Teruma Tetzaveh come before Parshas Kitisa, so maybe that's definitive. On the other hand, maybe Rashi's right, that Ein mukdam u'mu'uchar b'Torah. But there are examples in the Torah, and I'll bring you one now, where Rashi's 1,000% right, and the Ramban knows it. So when the Ramban says Yesh mukdam u'mu'uchar b'Torah, he knows that that's a general rule. It's not definitive because there are examples. You open to Parshas, to Sefer Bamidbar, and Sefer Bamidbar begins as follows. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe b'minar Sinai b'oel moed, be'echad lachodesh hasheni b'shana hashenit litzeitam me'eretz Mitzrayim le'mor. On what date? On the 2nd month on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the second month of the second year after Yetziat Mitzrayim. Okay, great. Unrelatedly, but in Parshas Ba'alotcha, so you have Bamidbar Naso Ba'alotcha, the third parsha, we find as follows in Perek Tet Pasuk Aleph. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'shana hashenit litzeitam me'eretz Yisraim b'chodesh harishon lemor. See, you can't deny that. The Torah says that the story that's about to be told about Pesach Sheni and the Tmei Nefesh happened before the beginning of Parshas Bamidbar. So the Ramban knows that. He doesn't deny it. And the Ramban in a number of places in Bamidbar acknowledges that there are situations in which the Torah is recounted out of order. So why would that be? So says the Ramban, yes, in the absence of definitive proof that something's out of order, we ought to read the Torah in order. In a way, it's not that different than Rashi saying, of course the Torah is in order, except for where we think it's out of order. Okay, now, how does that play out with respect to Chet HaEgel and the building of the Mishkan? And here I think there's a really, really significant point that's buried under this machlokes. Let's start for Rashi first, and then we'll read the Ramban inside. Rashi, I believe, Rashi definitively says that the purpose of the Mishkan was for Bnei Yisrael to get kapara for Chet HaEgel. Right? It makes complete sense. A terrible sin, Chet HaEgel, a terrible, terrible sin, says God, you know what? I'm going to give you something that will be mechaper for the Chet HaEgel. And Rashi, any number of times in Teruma, Tetzava, and in Vayakal Pekude, points out that this detail in the Mishkan is to be mechaper on Chet HaEgel, right? Yavo para utenakar. Okay, all these examples like that. So Rashi believes that the purpose of the Mishkan was functional. The purpose of the Mishkan was to attain kapara for the Chet HaEgel. Now, if the Ramban's going to hold as he does, that the Mishkan was commanded before Chet HaEgel, then it has to be that it's unrelated. The motivation for building the Mishkan, the purpose behind the Mishkan, has to be unrelated to Chet HaEgel. Yes, once there's a Mishkan, it could also help us to get kapara for Chet HaEgel, but that can't be the purpose if it was commanded beforehand. So then, what was the purpose of the Mishkan? Now we come to the Ramban. Beginning of Parshas Teruma, it's actually like it almost as an introduction to Parshas Teruma. Says the Ramban, and he's doing the narrative. He says, Ka'asher diber Hashem im Yisrael panim befanim aseret hadibrot. Once Maimad Har Sinai happened, and God delivered the aseret hadibrot to Bnei Yisrael, panim el panim, there was a gigantic Gilui Shechina. Vitziva otam al yidei Moshe ktsat mitzvot, shehem kimo avot lemitzvotel shel Torah. Right? So God, He didn't command us in 613 mitzvos, He commanded us in 10 mitzvos, aseret hadvarim. But they're not just any 10 mitzvos, they're 10 foundational, fundamental premises or precepts of Yadus that can be understood more broadly. Ka'asher hinhigu rabotenu im hagerim shebaim lihityahed. As Chazal commanded us to do with respect to converts, a great word, shebaim lihityahed. Right? It's not a word you read a lot, but we're coming up on Purim, right? And the Goyim wanted to be, they are mityahadim, they wanted to convert. Why? Ki nafal pachad Mordechai alehem. So it's hard to pass this by without pointing out the following, which is the Ramban says, in order to accept Gerim, you need to tell them the fundamentals of Judaism. Right? It's sort of a big fight now. Is it fair for Gerim to come to the Rabbanut? And the Rabbanut asked them, how do you calculate Zman Kriya Shema according to the Magen Avram? I think the Ramban would disagree with that. The Ramban says, no, you have to have Ktsat mitzvot shehem kimo avot lemitzvotel shel Torah. Right? You need to tell them enough so they can anticipate what's coming and they can know what it means to be a Jew. Okay, so after this happens at Maimad Har Sinai, v'Yisrael kiblu alehem la'asot kol ma sheyitzavem Al Yado Shel Moshe, and the Jewish people accepted the Torah, and they accepted prospectively that which Moshe Rabbeinu was going to command them. They had a covenant called Brit Na'aseh V'Nishma. Me'ata now, Hinehem lo la'am, v'hu lahem le'lokim. We are now God's people. We are identified as the chosen people, and God is our God. Right? We've entered into this covenant with Him. That's what God told Moshe Rabbeinu from the very beginning. That was what's going to happen. That's what happened. The pasuk says, "Va'ata im shamoa tishmu b'koli ushmartem et briti v'hiyitem li segula v'amar va'atem tihiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh." So what happened? He says, "V'hinei heim kidoshim re'uyim sheyihiyeh bohem mikdash lahashrot shchinato beinehem." Now that we are chosen, now that we've entered into a unique covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it makes sense, kiviyachol and lahavdil, to move in together, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to live amongst us, for us to get married, as people do. V'lachein tzivat chila al dvar ha-mishkan. So therefore, originally, before the Chet HaEgel, God commands us to build Him a Mishkan, sheyihiyeh lo bayit b'tocham mikudash lishmo. They'll have a place to live amongst us. V'sham yidaber im Moshe v'yitzaveh et b'nei Yisrael. And that's where He will meet with Moshe Rabbeinu and give further mitzvot and give maybe the rest of the Torah to b'nei Yisrael. V'hinei, key line, says the Ramban, Ikar hachefetz hu b'mishkan makom menuchat hashchina. The main purpose behind the Mishkan, says the Ramban, is the makom menuchat hashchina, is the makom hashraat hashchina. It's a place kiviyachol where HaKadosh Baruch Hu lives. It's a place where we can go and on some level meet HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, and if that's the case, the representation of God in the Mishkan is what? Shehu ha'aron. Right, when we think of where is God in the Mishkan, when we think of where's the makom, literally, of Ashras Hashchina, the answer is the Aron, mi bein shnei hakruvim, on top of the Aron or in the Aron, where the broken luchos are, k'moshe amar, v'noadati lecha sham v'dibarti itcha me'al hakaporet. Al Kain, now the Ramban's just going to explain the order of the Kalim. Hikdim ha'aron v'hakaporet bekan kihu mukdam b'ma'ala. So obviously the first vessel described in Parshas Teruma is the Aron, because the Aron is the makom menuchat hashchina, the makom hashraat hashchina. That's the highest level of kedusha in the Beit HaMikdash, or in the Mishkan. V'samach, then you go out from that. V'samach la'aron hashulchan, which is straight ahead, or to the side. V'hamnorah, which is one to the other side. Shehem kelim kamahu. V'yoru al inyan hamishkan. Sheba'avuram na'asa. And then the Torah will describe the Mishkan, the purpose of which are the kelim. Okay, now, just a side point, but the Ramban feels the need to describe this. Aval Moshe hikdim b'parshat vayakel et hamishkan et ha'olov et michseyu. But when you come, obviously there are two parshas that are more or less identical. There's Truma Tetzava, which is the mitzvah to build the Mishkan, and the Big Day HaKohanim. And then there's Vayakel Pekudei, which is the actual building of the Mishkan and the making of the Big Day Kahuna, etc. So he says, so in Vayakel Pekudei, Moshe starts with the building itself, with the Mishkan. V'chein asa b'tzalel. Lefi shahu hara'ui likadem b'ma'aseh. Says the Ramban, it could be that the most important room in your house is the kitchen. Or it could be the most important room in the house is your bedroom. But l'maisa, you have to build the frame of the house before you come to the most important room. So he says, when Moshe Rabbeinu describes how they did it, he obviously describes it from the Mishkan and from the external to the internal, because that's how the Mishkan was built, and that's how we think of the Mishkan. Okay, so what's clear so far in the Ramban is the Ramban wants no part of and has no part of this idea of Rashi, that Chet HaEgel came first. Why does the Mishkan come when it does? Right? We often think of the Mishkan as being sort of external to our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and external to what's going on in the Torah. And says the Ramban, no, it's actually part of the narrative. Maimad Har Sinai, right? Parshas Yisro, Maimad Har Sinai, Mishpatim, which the Ramban maybe will, maybe won't. Essentially, as he says, Parshas Mishpatim is what Moshe got on Har Sinai in the first 40 days, right? Then Moshe comes down and is about to tell Bnei Yisrael about the mitzvah of the Mishkan. Why? Because that's the next step in our relationship. Now that we're the Am HaNivchar, now that we've had a bris of Naasav and Ishma, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to live amongst us. What makes more sense to continue the relationship for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be there? Now, we could make up, and I could make up, and maybe next week we'll discuss it, why HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to live amongst us. That's a whole complicated idea. But why do we want HaKadosh Baruch Hu amongst us? Why is it so important for us? And now the Ramban says, maybe the most important line of this whole Ramban, V'sod HaMishkan, the secret of the Mishkan, but it's something that's accessible to all of us, Hu sheyihyeh hakavod asher shachan al Har Sinai shochein alav bin nistar. Right? What was Maimad Har Sinai? Maimad Har Sinai was a Gilui Shechina, maybe the most public Gilui Shechina in the history of the world. God appeared to Am Yisrael, 600,000 males and many, many more children and women, met God, saw God, experienced in some way God's presence on Har Sinai. And says the Ramban, when that happens, it creates within us a need that most of us, Bizman Hazeh, simply don't understand. And I'll explain it how I see it. The Ramban doesn't say this explicitly, but I think it's implicit in the Ramban. If you've ever asked yourselves, why do you find that Bnei Yisrael, that frum people, do Avodah Zarah? Avodah Zarah is the worst thing in the world. How could it possibly be that somebody keeps Shabbos and is Oved Avodah Zarah? So the answer to that is something we can't understand because we've never experienced it. But apparently, when you experience a Gilui Shechina, when you experience HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, it's a fantastic experience, but it also creates within you a need for some physical manifestation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence. We have never met God. We've never experienced God. Maybe in our minds, and maybe really we have, but we've never physically experienced God's presence. So the idea of worshiping something made of wood, something made of metal, a tree, it's crazy for us. And in fact, the Gemara tells a story that Klal Yisrael asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu to take away the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, and he did. And we benefit from that. Then Bnei Yisrael asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu to take away the Yetzer Hara for Arayos, and he granted it. And 3 days later, says the Gemara, you couldn't find an egg anywhere. Right? And we need it. We need it for society to work. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us that Yetzer Hara back. I think the Ramban would say, the way we have a Yetzer Hara for Arayos is the way people had a Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. Having felt God's presence, you were empty without it. You felt a need for something physical. So says the Ramban, God understood that, and God said immediately, I'm going to command you to build a Mishkan, which will be a mini traveling Har Sinai. Okay, let's go back to the Ramban. Kumoshen emasham vayishkon kivod Hashem al Har Sinai. Right? That's Maimad Har Sinai. The parallel is uksiv hein heranu Hashem Elokeinu et kvodo ve'et gadlo. V'chein katuv b'mishkan uchvod Hashem maleh et hamishkan. It was literally a recreation of Maimad Har Sinai. V'hizkir b'mishkan shnei pamim uchvod Hashem maleh et hamishkan kineged et kvodo ve'et gadlo. V'haya b'mishkan tamid im Yisrael hakavod shenira lahem b'har Sinai. And the Mishkan contained within it the glory of God that we had at Har Sinai. Ubebo Moshe haya elav hadibur shenidaber lo b'har Sinai. When Moshe came to the Mishkan, it was exactly like when Moshe went up to Har Sinai. Ukmo shema b'matan Torah. Min hashamayim yishme'achad kolo liyasreka ve'al haaretz herachat isho hagidola. Ki b'mishkan k'tiv vayishma et hakol midaber elav me'al hakapor mibein shnei hakruvim vayidaber elav v'nichpal vayidaber elav. Why? Lehagid ma she'amru b'Kabbalah. Shahaya hakol ba min hashamayim el Moshe. The voice would come to Moshe. How? Me'al hakaporet, on top of the Aron. Umisham midaberimo. And then the voice would speak to him. Ki kol dibur im Moshe hayamin hashamayim bayom. Every time Moshe spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it was during the day. V'nishma mibein shnei hakruvim kiderach udvarav shamata mitoch ha'esh va'al kein hayu shnehem zahav. The Ramban explains, we're not going to read on, that the gold kruvim on top of the Aron represented the fire that existed at the top of Har Sinai that God appeared in and that God spoke to Moshe from. So on a fundamental level, says the Ramban, the purpose behind the Mishkan was to fill the need of Klal Yisrael that they developed at Har Sinai. Once they developed that need, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to respond to that need. So he created a Gilui Shechina B'Nistar. He created a continuous Maimon at Har Sinai. We couldn't stay at Har Sinai forever. We had to go to Eretz Yisrael. So he created for us a traveling Har Sinai. It wasn't Benigla. It wasn't exactly like Har Sinai. But the Ramban has many, many textual parallels to make the point that the purpose behind the Mishkan was exactly the same purpose of Maimon Har Sinai. A place that Bnei Yisrael could go to experience HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence. Now, if that's the case, let's go backwards for a second. Okay? Now we come to the purpose of Maimon Har Sinai. So on a simple level, the purpose of the Mishkan. So on a simple level, the purpose of the Mishkan is to recreate Maimon Har Sinai B'Nistar. And that's what the Ramban says. But there's something more. Now we go back to the order of the Torah. Why was this mitzvah given before Chet HaEgel? So the answer is because it's unrelated to Chet HaEgel. The answer is that Klal Yisrael had a need after Maimon Har Sinai, and that need was filled by the Mishkan. It had nothing to do with Maimon Har Sinai. It had nothing to do with Chet HaEgel. Now, I think the Ramban would agree with Rashi. L'maisa, what happened on Shivasar B'Tammuz? Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai, all excited to give Bnei Yisrael the commandment to build a recreation of Har Sinai in the form of the Mishkan. But instead, Vayar Egel v'amechalot, he saw the terrible sin that Bnei Yisrael did, and he smashed the luchos, and history was sidetracked for a period of time. That's what happened. So why did the Torah put Teruma and Tetzaveh before Parshas Kitisa, before the Chet HaEgel? The answer is simple. Because God commanded the Mishkan to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. It was supposed to be before Chet HaEgel. It was supposed to be unrelated to Chet HaEgel. Rashi's right, and the Ramban would agree with that Lemaisa, Moshe Rabbeinu probably didn't give the mitzvos of Teruma and Tetzaveh till after Kitisa, right? Because Chet HaEgel interrupted everything, and Chet HaEgel sidetracked what was going to be our plan to build a Mishkan and to go into Eretz Yisrael. But Lemaisa, that's what happened. So in a way, Rashi and the Ramban are both agreeing on the history, but they're disagreeing on the purpose. For Rashi, by the way, I think Rashi would agree with the Rambam. The Rambam describes the Mishkan as a Beit Avodah. That's where you go to bring Karbanot. That's where you go to bring the Sachim. That's where you go to bring all the things to worship Avodah, to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the purpose of the Mishkan. And it serves to get you kapara for the Chet HaEgel. For the Ramban, that's absolutely not the purpose. For the Ramban, the purpose is to feel close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to feel elevated, to feel God's presence. L'maisa, there are all these other things that you can do and that you're supposed to do in the Mishkan. But that's not the purpose. The purpose of the Mishkan is the Aron. The purpose of the Mishkan is Hashras Hashchina. And oftentimes, like I imagine myself going to the Beis HaMikdash. And I imagine I sin b'shogeg all the time. And the Kohen there, my personal Kohen, sees me coming, and he says, what'd you do this time? I have to bring a chatas. I turned the light off in the middle of the night on Shabbos, what have you. I have to bring a chatas. That's how the Rashi and that's how the Rambam see the Mishkan. But I think the Ramban sees it much more optimistically. I come to the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohen says to me, what are you doing here? And I say, I want to feel God's presence. I want to feel inspired. I want to say Tehillim. I love God. I love the fact that I have a place to go visit Him. Yes, I could visit Him wherever I am. God is, Maloch al Aretz Kvodo. But there is something unique about the Mishkan. There is something unique about the Beit HaMikdash that doesn't exist elsewhere. Now, last point, and I want to be careful how I say this. If I'm right about Rashi, and it's clear that that's the case, you can ask a dangerous question, which is, wait, according to Rashi, is it possible that had we not sinned at Chet HaEgel, we wouldn't have ever gotten the mitzvah of building a Mishkan? So I think it's worth thinking about. L'maisa, again, had we not sinned at Chet HaEgel, we wouldn't have sinned with the Meraglim. We would have gone into Eretz Yisrael, in 11 days or whatever. It's literally that fast. It could be, we wouldn't have had to build a Mishkan. We would have come to Eretz Yisrael. We would have built a Beis HaMikdash immediately. Right? Not like how it played out, which is we had a Mishkan. So when we came into Eretz Yisrael, we didn't feel like we had to immediately build a Beit HaMikdash. And it took 400 plus years through David, through Shlomo for it to happen. But I want to raise the possibility. It's possible, according to Rashi, that was the case. According to the Ramban, and I don't mean the opposite of this. According to the Ramban, it was lechatchila. It was always the plan. Bnei Yisrael were going to have a recreation of Ma'amad Har Sinai through a Mishkan. It was going to be with them forever. Unrelated to Chet HaEgel, unrelated to anything that happened to us historically later. Yes, it's true that the Chet HaEgel intervened, but the Mishkan remains lechatchila. The Mishkan remains a makom hashras hashchina, a place represented by the Aron, with the fancy Ramban on Va'asu Aron instead of V'asisa Aron, all things that we've talked about before and we can talk about again. Anyway, that's the summary of the Ramban's Shita. The Ramban believes there is an order to the Torah, except when the Psukim are clear that it's not. Rashi, thinks otherwise, not always, but Rashi thinks if there's an educational purpose, the Torah can change its order. Either way, for Rashi, Truma and Tetzava come after Kitisa. For the Ramban, the Torah is written, as it almost always is, in the proper order. Truma Tetzava represent God's commanding Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai to build a Mishkan. The Egel interrupts it, and then we come back to it in Vayakal Pekudei when we actually build a Mishkan. Okay, I hope this was helpful. Hope it was clear. Yashkach to everybody, and see you, God willing, next week. Shabbat Shalom.